Mr. Thackeray seems fine with losing his entire party, let alone the chief ministership chair, but he doesn't want to have any truck with the BJP. You could see it between the three rebellions itself, the sheer intensity increasing, and it just went to the next level with the fourth, right? I mean, you lose a significant chunk of your party in the third. Fourth, you lose your party itself. One of Uddhav's first things when he started taking power in the Sena was to explicitly say it was not a party of linguistic chauvinism, right, in the early 2000s.
Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. There's been high drama in Maharashtra over the last couple of weeks. We've seen the resignation of Uddhav Thackeray as the Chief Minister, the collapse of the Maharashtra Vikas Agadi government, an alliance between the Shiv Sena and the NCP, and the rise of Eknath Shinde as the new Chief Minister. To discuss more about this, we have political expert and commentator Rohit Jayaraman on the podcast. You've heard him multiple times on Bharatvaarta, analyzing elections, making sense of parties and politics across the country. Welcome back, Rohit.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for having me back. Always great to be on the podcast.
Always great to have you. It's been a while, I should say,
Yeah, it's been a while.
and we're meeting in very dramatic circumstances also. Let's actually begin with that. Let's begin with a summary of what has transpired over the last couple of weeks. Some would say that this was inevitable, that the alliance was quite unnatural and bound to break at some point, but nobody could have predicted the manner in which these events have unfolded, right? So, yeah, what do you make of that?
I agree with you on that actually, right? So there was this article by Mr. Shekhar Gupta today or yesterday, I think, this national interest column, and he made the exact same point, right? So everyone said this alliance, when it came into effect, it'll be unstable and it'll break. Honestly, if you look at it, the alliance really wasn't unstable, right? I mean, they managed to do things without too much internal dissension till everything just exploded one fine day. And even in terms of how it would break, again, as Mr. Gupta said in his podcast, and this is something I've been discussing with multiple people I know, right? Always the expectation was that the Congress would break first, right? Because they would inevitably get tired of the Shiv Sena's Hindutva. What actually happened, however, and probably led to the alliance breaking due to another source was that the Shiv Sena, or rather at least Mr. Uddhav Thackeray, really compromised on Hindutva, right? I mean, there was very little difference between what him or what his government was doing, or at least what his primary spokesperson, Mr. Sanjay Raut, was saying, and what any other opposition party was saying, right? So there was actually very little, there was no reason to think that Shiv Sena was going full gung ho on Hindutva, and you could see that in the Congress also, right? They found it perfectly comfortable to stay with the government till the end. The NCP also is, of course, a party that's avowedly secular and interestingly enough has actually turned even more secular over the last 2 3 years, especially since the formation of this Mahavikas Agadi, and a couple of months between the 2019 Lok Sabha elections and assembly elections in Maharashtra. So they were also comfortable. So honestly, at the top levels of leadership of the three parties involved, at the topmost levels, I would say rather, there was a lot of synergy, right? I, for one, really thought that Congress would break it if they saw that Muslims would were leaving the party in, say, Kerala, right, or even in Bengal. But I think the Congress had the good sense to understand that actually, Muslim votes did go away from the Congress in these states, but that was not because of their alliance with Shiv Sena or something. It was just keeping in mind the local circumstances, right? So the Congress was fine. The NCP again was the second best option, people thought, because to break this alliance, because there's always been this sort of a illicit love affair between the BJP and the NCP, right? At least that's how the perception has been on social media, on mainstream media, everywhere. I don't think that's necessarily true. There are sections of the NCP which share a very good bonhomie with sections of the BJP, or rather with the BJP itself as a party. But in the current context in the NCP, it's clearly Mr. Sharad Pawar who calls the shots, and I think he's very clear that he doesn't want to be in a formal alliance with the BJP, right? Irrespective of whatever people might say of his relationship with the Prime Minister or lots of other things. I mean, I wouldn't want to get into that. So the NCP actually didn't rock the boat, and to be fair, of course, as we would discuss about this in this rebellion, it was the NCP that was controlling the government, right? So there was really no reason for them to rock the boat. Even people in the NCP who would rather be otherwise on good terms with the BJP, they were also, so as to speak, enjoying the fruits of power. So there was no real reason for them to break it. The most unlikely option to break the alliance actually was always expected to be the Shiv Sena, for the simple reason that it looked like relationships between Mr. Uddhav Thackeray on one hand and the BJP on the other had sort of irretrievably broken down. And I mean, the last 2 weeks clearly pointed to that. Like Mr. Thackeray seems fine with losing his entire party, let alone the chief ministership chair, but he doesn't want to have any truck with the BJP. That's one relationship that's absolutely broken down, and people were right in diagnosing it. However, a few people did, sort of mention that there were groups inside the Shiv Sena who would much rather ally with the BJP, which of course makes sense given not just the history of the parties, but the fact that these two parties actually fought in an alliance in 2019, right? So there will obviously be people in the Shiv Sena who would be more sympathetic to the BJP, but the expectation, I think, at least because nothing had happened for almost 2 years, and I'm talking at a very personal level here, was that even if there were such people, the numbers just would have proven to be too much of a this thing to overcome, right? I mean, what has happened now, where 39 Shiv Sena MLAs, went to Guwahati and then to Goa, and they are today in the Shinde camp, so as to speak. That's a huge number, right? I mean, 39 MLAs is like, this is a much bigger scale than your so-called like, if you start with the history of the so-called Operation Kamala, right? I mean, since both of us are now Bangalorean, Operation Kamala has a separate connotation for us. But I mean, just look at the numbers involved, right? In one go, getting 39 people has never been done before. So clearly, that was unexpected, and I think most people did not really expect it. Though everyone knew that if at all the Shiv Sena was ever going to do anything like that, or something was ever going to come from within the Shiv Sena like that, it was always going to be led by Mr. Eknath Shinde, right? And that's what's ultimately panned out. Like multiple people had predicted on Twitter that Mr. Shinde, and I'm not saying predicted on Twitter like 2 months back, 3 months back. The day Uddhav took oath, the days before Uddhav took oath, the days after Uddhav took oath, whenever people talking about the general stability of this government, and the talk moved to the Shiv Sena, the first point of this thing for everyone was that Mr. Shinde might break away, but I don't think anyone expected him to be able to do it in such a spectacular fashion, right? And that's where I think probably this political crisis, to some extent, did maybe come as a bit of a surprise to people who are not otherwise 24/7 clued into Maharashtra politics, or I mean, even people who are 24/7 clued into Maharashtra politics. Like there's enough circumstantial evidence to show that Uddhav Thackeray had no idea, clearly.
Yeah.
Neither did the so-called Chanakya of Maharashtra politics, Sharad Pawar. So clearly, two of the most senior people of the Mahavikas Aghadi at least had no idea this was going to happen. This point, lots of things that in hindsight, make you realize that this was bound to happen. But I think at least when it came as a surprise.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. I mean, 35 plus MLAs crossing the state, and then right after cross voting in the MLC elections, and all of this coming as a big surprise to the leader of the alliance itself, is something extraordinary, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are two things interesting here, right? One is when first there was cross voting in the Rajya Sabha elections, which happened, I think, a week before the MLC elections or 10 days before the MLC election. There, the BJP won one seat more than it was expected to. And there, what happened was there were two different things in there from the Legislative Council, right? The first was the number of votes required for the BJP was actually lesser. At the same time, it was not a secret ballot, so it had to depend entirely on, independents and people like that. Like the people inside the party couldn't defect. So the BJP managed to get enough independence that, in hindsight, should have probably set off an alarm for the MVA, which actually they did try to do. No, I mean, they went to Devendra Fadnavis and said that. I mean, there were rumors that they had offered to give him the next MLC seat or something so that he wouldn't fight the fifth seat. Obviously, I mean, given what transpired, he didn't agree to that proposal. And then when the MLC elections also happened, if you look at the numbers, I mean, all the initial commentary was on the Congress, right? Because the Congress managed to mess up the elections spectacularly, even by some of the recent standards of the Congress party itself. Because they had 44 MLAs, you had one MLA of the CPM, you had two of the AIMIM and two of the SP, and there's supposed to be at least a deal that at least one of them, of these two, one of the MLAs of both these parties, and apart from the CPM MLA, they would support the Congress. I don't know what exactly happened. It's a secret ballot. That's the main distinction between the MLC and the Rajya Sabha elections. But the Congress ended up getting only 41 votes, right? So at a bare minimum, three of them cross-voted, and the fight was always between the Congress's second candidate and the BJP's fifth, and the BJP won. So people tripped on the Congress. This was made even more like funny because the Congress MLAs cross-voted amongst themselves, right? Like when the Congress nominated two candidates, there was an order of precedence, and Mr. Chandrakant Handore was the first candidate, and Mr. Jagtap was the second. But the Congress guys, not only, I mean, in this whole MVA thing, not only did they get the BJP BJP's fifth candidate across the line. In the Congress also, that order of precedence sort of went for a toss, and Jagtap got elected instead of Handore, which had a wider thing because Handore is a pretty big Dalit leader, right? I mean, Dalits are very, very important to the Congress's political base in Maharashtra. At least if you ask me, I was focusing on that. Then I started seeing reports that, the Sena only got 52 votes, right? I mean, while as per its putative numbers, it should have got 64, including the independents who had gone on record supporting the Sena. It had 55 MLAs, then one MLA had joined it, so 56, and there were no, there were 8 MLAs who were sort of independent supporting the Sena, and it ended up with 52, which means even in your best case scenario, there were at least 3 guys who cross voted, right? That people started talking about slightly later, but then I think everyone just, I mean, it was late in the night. This result also came late in the night. At least in my case, I went to bed in the morning. I'm like, nobody knows where Eknath Shinde is, right? And you're like, okay, now shit has hit the fan. Like, clearly something is afoot. Again, I didn't think that, what I at least thought in the initial hours was, and I read that 20-25 MLAs had crossed over and had disappeared, and it was very clear that, or to use the term that was used the whole of the last 10 days, unreachable. At least a few of them were independent. So at least in the initial reports, it was around 20 to 25 Sena MLAs, right? And that was quite lesser than the threshold of 38 that they actually needed, 37 or 38, depending on how you do the numbers, that they actually needed. So I was like, maybe these guys are going to resign, and there might be a separate breakaway from the Congress or the NCP who'd all resign. But see, if you look at the resignation numbers, the numbers were huge, right? I mean, getting 50 people to resign is not like, nobody likes fighting elections more than required. It's a lot of energy, time, effort, money, and also you don't know the result, right? I mean, up in the air. So why would anyone take a chance when there were 2 years of your term left? So I was like, I don't know what these guys are up to. But then you saw that there were more, like, this was, I think, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, Tuesday night, these guys were going to Guwahati. When I went to sleep, they were, I think, around, say 1 o'clock. They were still waiting in Surat to board the flight to Guwahati. When I woke up, they had landed in Guwahati, and apparently 8-9 others had come from somewhere else, right? I mean, till today, no one exactly knows whether they came from Surat or via some other place. So there were more in number, and then you began to see that, okay, maybe something is really happening, right? And then, I mean, this is really the most tragicomic part of the story, right? MLAs would keep going away, like in one or two batches of 1, 2, or 3. They would just keep disappearing from Maharashtra, turn up in Surat, which seemed to, act as some sort of a welcome lounge for the MLAs before they were sent to Guwahati. So again, I mean, lots of people ask this question on Twitter, at least, what are these guys doing in Surat? And that answer has never really come out in public, at least. But clearly something was happening there. I've been joking that they were all being given welcome kits. But whatever it is, they were turning up in Guwahati. And I think by the time the two of the last guys, right, Mr. Dada Bhuse and Sanjay Rathod, I think they were MLAs 36 and 37 or 37 and 38 of the Sena. Now I'm discounting the independents and smaller party guys because they don't count for this number game. When by the time they turned up, it was clear the writing was on the wall, right? I mean, the government was clearly out of control. The 39th MLA, Mr. Uday Samant, when he reached Guwahati, this stat came around on Twitter that, of every person elected on the Shiv Sena symbol as an MLA who was then, made a minister, except Adithya Thackeray, each one of them was in Guwahati, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a point which you realize that something huge has happened. And that's what Mr. Shinde said in his interview with Republic yesterday, right? Like, this is a point at which you need to start doing self-reflection. If so many people are leaving, like, what has happened? Of course, you really haven't seen that from the Uddhav camp as of yet. Maybe they'll do it in private, or you may get to hear more over the next few years or months. But clearly, that's how this whole thing played out. And then after that, it was a very intricate legal games, right? Because of this whole two-thirds and merger.
Hmm.
First, Uddhav's camp tried to change the legislature party leader, which again is arguable, right? Whether they had the right to do it or not. But the deputy speaker, because he was from the NCP, he accepted whatever the Uddhav camp was doing. But I think where the Uddhav camp probably went wrong was in issuing a disqualification notice, right? Because the moment they issued a disqualification notice to these 16 guys, they had a reason to go to court. They went to court. There's been enough judgments, the past few years, which tells you how the court interprets the speaker slash deputy speaker's role in these kind of scenarios. I think the court broadly went by that. It asked the deputy speaker to basically, not take any coercive action against these guys till the next hearing. What that basically did was it just took the deputy speaker out of the equation, right? And I think this is very important to understand the sequence as people on social media might say, आप chronology समझिए, right? It's very important in this case, really, because because the Uddhav camp made a move to bring the deputy speaker into action. These guys could go to court, get it blocked. If they hadn't and kept him, in reserve till whenever the putative floor test was about to happen, maybe things could have been different. So the moment the court blocked the deputy speaker, these guys lost their only real weapon, right? And then immediately Fadnavis went to the governor with a letter saying these guys don't have majority. And I mean, if you look at Bhagat Singh Koshari's actions over the last 2.5 years, it's almost like he was waiting for this letter. He would be like getting up every day, probably hoping this letter was. So he got the letter and he immediately acted, right. And the moment he did that, then the owners shifted to the MVA to go to the court and get a order blocking it. And again, there, I mean, this government had clearly lost majority. It was obvious, like the numbers were very clearly not there. It was quite difficult for the court to, not order a floor test. I mean, whatever is especially because the Uddhav camp had only disqualified 16 of the 39 Sena MLAs who were not there. So, I mean, even if those 16 didn't vote, the government still didn't have the majority. So, I think that's where it went. And I think the last cardinal error Uddhav did in this whole thing, I would say, is that he resigned, right? I mean, there's been a lot of chatter from the media that, NCP and Congress were livid with Uddhav that he resigned. But he resigned, and that's just completely changed it, right? Because if he hadn't resigned, there's always a court battle. You never know what happens in court, right? Courts can be unpredictable, as we saw in an unrelated case yesterday. So you have no idea what a court can do, and I mean, Uddhav just. I could say, just gave the initiative away by resigning.
He probably expected a more of a sympathetic response to that, right? I mean, I think, I mean, if you kind of rewind back and think of a previous Sena leader who would have said what he said and done what he did, I think, you would have had tens of thousands of people, on the street, in support. But you hardly saw those kind of numbers, right? Which means that I think, support for him was waning anyway, I think.
That's a very interesting point, right? And that probably, I mean, I may have been a bit harsh in saying he completely gave it up by resigning, right? Because at that point, I mean, what was he fighting for? Because his, like, literally 2/3 of his party was somewhere else. There was very little pressure on them from their constituencies, at least in public. I mean, if you watch Marathi media, and Marathi media was trying its best to be sympathetic towards Uddhav, right? You could see them just going around a few isolated pockets in Mumbai and finding a few people. You just were not seeing protests outside Mumbai, right? That was, even in Mumbai, it was very muted. I mean, interestingly, I was in Mumbai on 29th. I think he resigned on 30th, or he resigned on 29th. I was in Mumbai that day and there was nothing happening, right? I mean, I was in Worli and Prabhadevi, right? I mean, Lower Parel, like these are hotbeds of Sena support, and like life was absolutely normal. As you rightly mentioned, this was not something that would have happened a few years back. And I think that takes us to the very character of the Shiv Sena itself, how it's changed over the years, and of Uddhav as a leader, and how he's different from his father. Right? I mean, Shiv Sena, whatever people associate with the Shiv Sena and its brand of politics, was very like inextricably linked to Mr. Balasaheb Thackeray, right? And whatever he did, because he also changed his positions, or rather the thrust of his ideology on a couple of occasions, and there was no, I mean, his cadre followed him blindly, right? But that clearly didn't follow through with Uddhav. And since you mentioned the rebellions, if you look at the rebellions again chronologically, right, starting from Chhagan Bhujbal, where he went with 18 MLAs in the early 90s, 11 of those MLAs just went back, and there was so much physical violence, right? Like some of these MLAs were really scared what would happen to them. You follow that with, the rebellion of Narayan Rane, where Rane, I think, left with 5 or 7 MLAs of. He again joined the Congress. Nothing happened, right? I mean, there were some skirmishes, but by and large, all of the MLAs who went with him, most of them at least, continued to win their seats easily on Congress tickets. He, of course, had a fairly successful career in the Congress till he sort of joined the BJP. And the Sena, at least in Rane's home district of Sindhudurg, the Sena could not really recover till the Modi wave, right? I mean, that's when they could finally throw Rane out, or I mean, at least throw him and one of his sons out, while his other son continued to be an MLA. The third rebellion was Raj Thackeray, and I mean, like, Raj Thackeray just wrecked havoc, right? Like, he went in 2005 or 2006, and he completely screwed the Sena till 2012. 2009, he screwed the BJP and the Sena. Like, forget municipal or assembly elections, even at the parliament level, right? I mean, the entire 10 seats of MMR plus even Pune and Nasik, 12 seats, these guys, the Sena BJP could win just one seat by a narrow margin, and almost 8 or 9 of these seats, the winning margin was of the Congress NCP was lesser than the MNS's vote count. He just wreaked havoc, and it required a lot of factors for Uddhav to sort of beat him back in 2012, hold on to the BMC, and that's where I think Raj also, I mean, his own failures as a politician began to catch up with him. And of course, in 2014, because of the Modi wave, the Sena landed the knockout punch, you could say, to the MNS. MNS has been a fringe outfit ever since then, irrespective of whatever it did. But you could see it between the three rebellions itself, the sheer intensity increasing, and it just went to the next level with the fourth, right? I mean, you lose a significant chunk of your party in the third. Fourth, you lose your party itself. So, and I mean, from Narayan Rane, each of the three of them left because they had a problem with Uddhav, right? Like, it's not that Narayan Rane has ever said he had a different ideology. Like, his rise in the Congress also, to that extent, was stymied because the Congress also saw him as someone who inherently was a Shiv Sena guy with whatever the Shiv Sena's politics are, Hindutva. The MNS, of course, was in your face of, or it was even saying that it was more Sena than the Sena itself. So again, no ideological difference. Eknath Shinde is saying that Uddhav's betrayed the Sena's ideology. Whatever your views are, that clearly all these three people have left some way or the other because they had issues with Uddhav. While Chhagan Bhujbal left because of reservation and the Sena's attitude to reservation, which is completely different topic. These three clearly left for because they had issues with Uddhav, and I think the cookies finally come.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little more, right? I mean, the reason for the fissure in Shiv Sena. Do you think it's largely ideological? That the Sena guys did not like the shift away from Hindutva, or do you think it was more opportunistic that the power was being centralized in the Uddhav camp, and there were other people who perhaps thought that they deserved better, and the somewhere in this whole power sharing and the functioning of daily things took over, right? I mean, that came to a head. What do you see as the reason?
When you see 50 people leave, right, or 39, I mean, Shinde says 50, but he's counting independent MLAs. Let's leave them aside. If 39 people leave a party out of 55, it can't be one reason. I mean, they're never going to be the one reason, right? I think almost all of what you said played a role out. So let's sort of take them one by one. You start with ideology, right? And I mean, a lot of people on, again, this thing, I don't watch mainstream media, at least on Twitter, a lot of people are skeptical, right, of the ideology involved. But I mean, if you look at the Shiv Sena, and that's why the Shiv Sena in its former avatar at least is different from any of the other allies of the BJP, right? Like, I mean, Mr. Shekhar Gupta said, BJP always had two allies, the Shiv Sena and the Akali Dal. But the Akali Dal is a different party. I mean, it's literally a party of Sikhism and Hinduism. There are huge interpretational differences, right? Especially in how the two religions sort of view each other. That's not the case with the Shiv Sena. Right? The Shiv Sena was an out and out Hindutva party. And one, interesting thing that pro Uddhav journalists at least try to do after 2019, and it's been said in columns again and again that the Shiv Sena always had two strands to it: Marathi pride and Marathi ethnic or linguistic nationalism and Hindutva. Right now, that's actually a very, I would say, warped reading of things, right? Because the Shiv Sena, yes, started out as a party of Marathi ethnic nationalism. It started for the protecting the rights of the Marathi Manus, right, in the 60s. That's what it stood for. But ever since Balasaheb Thackeray, for whatever reason, decided to reorient the party towards Hindutva sometime in the mid 80s, the Shiv Sena has always been a Hindutva party. I mean, it's very rarely, till this whole divide with the BJP started cropping up around 2014, it very rarely said anything on Marathi issues, right? I mean, it was very clearly a nationalist party. You could see Shiv Sena units sprout up all over India. I mean, they were all very, insignificant electorally, politically, but they would be, the most rabble rousing or most right wing. They were literally a competition to the Bajrang Dal, right? I mean, at least where I come from, and many others non Maharashtrian states, and it wasn't like the National Party was, or rather the Maharashtra, or Mr. Balasaheb Thackeray was distancing himself from them, right? He was very clear. This was a Hindutva party. If you listen to his later interviews or any of his interviews from the 90s, what he said, what he did, it's very clear this is a party of Hindutva. I mean, yes, he had his personal relationships with a few people or whatever, but at its core, the Shiv Sena was an extreme, or rather a more right-wing BJP, right? I mean, at its core, that was what the Shiv Sena had turned out to be by, I would say, the mid 2000s or something, right? Let's just stop it then. You need to look at the amount of time involved, right? It's not like Balasaheb Thackeray made this change in the mid 2000s and we are in 2022. He made this change in the mid 1980s. So today, if I had joined the Shiv Sena in say 1989 because as I say, a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old, I would be in my early 50s today, right?
Hmm.
Like, and any political party, the bulk of the people who actually control the nuts and bolts of the party are generally people in their 40s to 60s, right? All the people in the Shiv Sena who joined it, or who are in the Shiv Sena of this age today, joined it. The vast majority of them joined it at the time when it was a Hindutva party. Like, that's what they actually, you could say, signed up for, right? And again, Sena's peculiar characteristic, it's kind of people it draws its cadre from, and the kind of people it promotes. And again, this is a very subtle distinction between the Sena and the BJP, right? I mean, there's a lot of chatter on how Eknath Shinde was an auto rickshaw driver, somebody else was a pan wala, somebody else was a vegetable seller, somebody else was a security guard. And while of course, I mean, Uddhav and Adithya rather bizarrely, sort of use this in a disparaging manner to say that, we made such people into MLAs or whatever, and look what they've done, which is quite weird considering they wanted these guys to come back to them. But and you don't get that by insulting them. But leaving that aside, like, these kind of people, they have joined a political party for a particular ideology, right? Like, you don't join a party in this just randomly. Like, most people who are at the lower levels join parties by and large for ideology. I mean, I know that goes against the cynical view of politics that a lot of people have, but and especially for cadre based parties like the BJP, the Sena, the communist parties, even the DMK, these are parties where people do join for ideology. And you have to sort of, when you try to understand, you can't understand the Shiv Sena by, studying in the same lens as you would, I mean, and I don't want to a particular party, but certain other regional parties, right? People join it for other reasons. Like, you join the BSP for by and large, people join the BSP for an ideology. People join the Akali Dal for an ideology, like at the lower levels, right? The big difference between the Sena and all of the other parties, and this again is due to the charismatic character of Balasaheb Thackeray, is that at least in its real strongholds, right? That is your Mumbai belt, Thane belt, Konkan, parts of Marathwada, etc. These people who join at the lower levels from, what I would say, relatively impoverished backgrounds, they are allowed to rise through the ranks, right? It's them who become your MLAs, who become your ministers, who become whatever they become, right? Unlike other parties where, these people by and large stay as people who work maybe at the village level, maximum at a Zilla Parishad or something like that. MLA, MP are, sort of restricted to people from slightly more, I would say, affluent or elite backgrounds, right? Like, that sort of filtering happens in every party to different levels. The communists do it to a slightly lesser extent. The BJP to again a slightly lesser extent. Most of the other parties are very clear about this, right? You look at the background of an NCP or a Congress MLA, especially in a Maharashtra, and you compare it to the Shiv Sena, there's a huge socio-economic difference. That's something I think Uddhav or some of the others sort of underestimated when they thought of how much ideology matters, right? I think ideology did play a role here, and this whole thing that, Sena had two strands of ideology, I don't think that's accurate. I mean, by the 2000s, when Raj Thackeray left, Raj Thackeray actually got a lot of his votes because he started talking about Marathi linguistic nationalism again, right? Like, because the Sena had stopped talking about it. I mean, one of Uddhav's first things when he started taking power in the Sena was to explicitly say it was no longer, and by then it was outwardly also clear, but he made it very explicit that it was not a party of linguistic chauvinism, right? In the early 2000s, that's where the MNS came in. So to say that, Sena had two strands, Uddhav was just getting rid of the later strand of Balasaheb Thackeray is, I would say, quite nonsensical, right? Like, 90% of the people who were in the Sena had joined at some point due to that. Like, whether they are okay to move on from it or not was an open question. Clearly, we've seen that probably they weren't. But that's that. And what are the other factors? And this is important, right? The Sena has been alliance with the BJP for almost 25 to 30 years,
Yeah,
right?
three
They've
decades.
been fighting against the Congress. I mean, and the NCP is just an offshoot of the Congress, which has been in alliance most of the time with the Congress. Like, it's fought two elections separately from the Congress out of the 5 elections it's fought. So it's literally a twin to the Congress. So there's no point in comparing like separating the two out. So these people who join the Sena, by and large, especially in rural areas, right? I mean, outside your Mumbai region and others, they started by, trying to take power from the Congress. And Maharashtra, till the 90s, it was the last one party state in India, right? Like, the first real non-Congress government. And when I say real, because, Sharad Pawar had formed some Khichdi coalition in the 70s. But I mean, you can't really say Sharad Pawar is the first non-Congress Chief Minister of Maharashtra. Like, he's clearly an ideological congressman. So the first real non-Congress government was in 95. I mean, you compare to any other state, that's really late, right? So, and that's because if you look at the list of MLAs in Maharashtra, the number of times the same guy got elected on the Congress ticket or their children, and then the Sena and the BJP sort of represented a break. I mean, they may have taken in new elites or old, they might have given it to Carter or the nouveau rich or, middle class. more, what do you say? These guys were the aristocrats. You could call them the smaller level of people, right? Of the elite who were trying to break in. So that was the kind of people who joined the Sena at that point, right? Or the BJP for that matter. And that's where it comes from. Where would these guys go in an alliance, right? I mean, whether they were MLAs or not, would the Congress and NCP have given these guys all the seats to contest without a fight? You don't know, right? I mean, if I'm a Sena MLA, I'm a three-time MLA. The last two times the two times I lost all the last five, it was to an NCP guy. He's still in the NCP. How do I know how it's going to actually play out in the next election? I won't even have BJP support because BJP will obviously. Will the NCP guy go to the BJP? Will he fight as an independent? What will I be left? It's a very serious existential question for the Sena, right? And or rather for the Sena MLAs. And then there was the whole question of fund allotment, which these guys have been harping on a lot. That the NCP controlled the purse strings in the government. They were deliberately not releasing funds, and that sort of matches with this, right? And the last one is personality. Again, Uddhav clearly has a clique. You can see that there's Sanjay Rao, there's his son. His son was getting promoted a lot. Maybe that irritated Mr. Shinde. I mean, I'm sure the other MLAs weren't really competing with Adithya Thackeray, happy to do whatever they were doing. But at least for somebody like Mr. Shinde, maybe he thought that, why was he not getting projected? There was also the whole thing that when this government was formed, the initial idea was he would be the chief minister and not Uddhav. And it was apparently Sharad Pawar who insisted that Uddhav be the CM. Now, obviously, if you see what had happened recently, you can understand why probably Pawar wanted that. Makes sense. But that's how I think it's a mix of factors. But I think there's a genuine issue here. There was a genuine issue.
Let's talk about a few of the characters of this sort of Shakespearean drama that we saw, right? Beginning with, I think, Eknath Shinde itself. Auto driver to Sena strongman to now Chief Minister. He is clearly the man of the moment. Could you give the listeners a brief background of his, how he came up through the ranks and so on?
So I think this is now fairly public, so I wouldn't spend too much time on it. But Mr. Shinde, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, he's originally from Satara district. That's suddenly come up in the news again with a lot of theories that the BJP wanted him to be the CM so they could show they were backing a Western Maharashtra leader from the Maratha community and all of that. Mr. Sharad Pawar added to the mix by saying he's the fourth CM from Satara district. So I think it looks like Mr. BJP probably yes did want this and Mr. Pawar got the message. But he's originally from Satara, but he's by and large grown up in Thane's youth. He joined the Sena. He had done a lot of jobs like auto rickshaw driver. Then the time apparently he worked in some sort of fishing boat or something to do with fishing. Then he worked in a brewery. So he did a bunch of odd jobs and then joined the Sena. And I think that's where the whole character of Mr. Anand Dige comes in, right? Because Mr. Shinde took oath in his name. I mean, he took oath in the name of Balasaheb Thackeray and Anand Dige. So at least to a lot of people, I think Anand Dige may not be well known. So, and I think there is some particular relevance of him in this whole story. So Mr. Shinde started working with Mr. Anand Dige, who practically ran the Thane Sena, right? I mean, I think from around the early or mid 80s till his death in 2001, he literally controlled Thane. He was called Dharamveer, right? There's a movie on his name which I'll just get to. But so Mr. Dige brought up, Mr. Shinde rose through the ranks with Mr. Dige. He became a corporator. Then he became the head of the Thane municipality or the corporation while working with Mr. Dige. At that time, he suffered a great personal tragedy. I mean, this is all there on Wikipedia, so I'm not repeating it. But the interesting thing here really is once Mr. Dige died in an accident, which created a lot of huge outpouring of public emotion and stuff like that. Mr. Shinde managed to control the Sena, right? I mean, in Thane to a large extent. And 2004, he became an MLA. He held on. He got a new seat in 2009. Held on in 2014. Became the leader of the opposition because Sena didn't join the government. Then became practically the number two in the government itself and the head of the Sena. Then he again, of course, 2019. And so he just rose through the ranks. By and large, managed to protect Thane and Kalyan right from the NCP. He definitely did. He was not so successful against the MNS, though the MNS's successes in Thane were slightly lesser as compared to its successes in Mumbai and Nasik, which were real hotbeds of MNS support. But whatever it is, he did it. And I think going back to Mr. Dige, right? I mean, there was this movie on his life which was released a few months back called Dharamveer, which interestingly was sort of, I think it's been produced by Mr. Shinde, right? It's there or it was conceived or it's even heavily backed by him, let's put it that way, out on Z5. It's an interesting movie, right? It shows one, what exactly the Sena was up to in Thane during Mr. Dige's lifetime. It also has Mr. Shinde in a fairly prominent role himself. I mean, obviously a different actor. Other protagonists of this rebellion or in the Sena who are all in the movie. And there's an interesting nugget that Uddhav Thackeray walked out of the screening, right? And the official claim is that he couldn't bear to see Dharamveer die on screen, right? But if you actually see the movie, you realize that no, I mean the movie is so heavily full of symbolism on Hindutva. The movie is very clearly anti-Congress. The movie gives very little role to Uddhav Thackeray himself, right? In the whole movie, there's very little role to him. He's not even shown except in one small scene. It actually shows Raj Thackeray more. It shows Bala Sahib Thackeray obviously to some extent, but it sort of shows the Thane Sena as some sort of a world onto itself, right? I mean, Thackeray is sort of semi-detached, especially Uddhav Thackeray, who was like completely irrelevant. So I wouldn't be surprised that Uddhav Thackeray actually walked out of the movie and sort of, I don't know. Clearly, this thing has been in the works for a while. This rebellion. I think there's definitely a lot you can understand about how at least Mr. Shinde and some of the other protagonists of this rebellion see themselves when you watch that movie. I mean, the amount of pure scorn on the Congress, right? Like that's quite interesting considering the man who released it is a minister in a government with Congress as a partner. I mean, that's just hilarious, and it's sort of natural that it's no longer existing, that government.
Interesting. I mentioned that this is kind of a Shakespearean drama, and if that is the case, then Uddhav Thackeray is clearly King Lear, right? People have said that he was not a natural leader like Bala Sahib, and that I mean, his recent medical complications and so on, where he's had to stay aloof from all of the action, hasn't helped either. But what do you think? I mean, I don't think he rested easy on that throne.
See, Uddhav Thackeray, at the end of the day, he was clearly different from Bala Sahib Thackeray. I mean, the kind of speeches he did, the kind of command he had on his cadre, etc. It was obviously at a different level as compared to Bala Sahib Thackeray. I think ideologically also Uddhav Thackeray had an issue. The problems that come from, or I would say that the entire BJP Sena alliance, right? Because the two parties, at least in Maharashtra, were literally joined at the hip, and it was a very both the parties were fairly insignificant in the politics of the state before the alliance. Then the alliance happened, and if you look at it now, I mean, again, I'm quoting Shekhar Gupta because he made this point that the BJP started as a very very junior partner to the Shiv Sena and sort of grew into it. I think that's wrong, right? I mean, if you look at 1985, which was the last election the two parties didn't contest, which was contested before they allied, the BJP did much better than the Sena. I mean, the Sena was literally nothing. Even in the first election they contested as allies, the BJP gave a lot more seats to the Sena, but wherever it contested did better, and that's how it has been by and large over the years. Of course, till 2014 when everything completely changed due to the Modi effect. I mean, why did the BJP do that? It obviously did that because it realized that its leaders, the leaders the BJP had in Maharashtra, were nowhere at the level of charisma of Mr. Bala Sahib Thackeray. He was, in terms of charisma and his hold among the masses, etc., he was a legend, right? Politically. I mean, whether you agree with his views, disagree, or whatever he did, but he was an absolute legend in terms of his charisma. And the BJP is by and large run by Pramod Mahajan and Gopinath Munde for most of the 90s and the early 2000s, and they also saw that maybe they couldn't really I mean, in terms of charisma or electoral appeal, hold a candle to Bala Sahib, but the BJP has a better organization, right? And so you need to realize that so that's where that deal sort of went, that Sena would get a share of the seats, but that wasn't really based on actual strength of the ground. And Uddhav Thackeray, when he took over, he sort of expected that to continue, right? Like he was comfortable with that. The moment that was sort of questioned by Mr. Modi and Amit Shah and others, he sort of went on a different tangent. I think he generally had a tendency to, he wasn't as Hindutva minded as Bala Sahib, and that obviously led to a friction in the alliance, because then it starts becoming competing alliance, right? Like two parties, if they're like completely on the same page, and you sort of make these compromises because you know that whatever happens, they're with you. But the moment you sort of seeing that as divergence, then it becomes like any other alliance, right? Like I mean, the BJP ADMK alliance is always in the news, some friction or the other. The less said about the alliance with the JDU, the better. Like I'm just talking from the BJP's perspective. Or I mean, yeah, other alliances also. Like BJP used to ally with the JMM. That was always a fractious alliance because they are differing interests, right? It's always an alliance of convenience. And if it's not an alliance of conviction and alliance of convenience, then it makes no sense for either party to sort of
Compromise.
give a free ride to the other, right? It sort of goes out, and that's where, if you remember, the Sena voted for Pranab Mukherjee in 2012 presidential election, because in the last months of Bala Sahib's life, clearly the gap was growing, right? Then Uddhav was very unhappy with the whole Mr. Modi being the PM candidate even in 2013. 2014, of course, the dam broke. The two partners contested separately. Then they of course had to come together because the BJP couldn't get a majority on on its own, and Sena realized like why stay outside randomly. But I mean, even then, Sanjay Raut. I mean, Sanjay Raut's been a household name for political analysts for the last 8 years, right? Like it's not just the last 2 years he's been making outrageous statements against the BJP. He's been doing that since at least 2014, if not before. So clearly, there's been a divergence, right? And the gap just kept growing. So that's where I think this sort of happened. And then, of course, over once the alliance broke, we again went into how why a lot of people in the Sena may not be comfortable with the NCP or the Congress. And then Mr. Thackeray unfortunately had his health issues, which sort of made him more remote or inaccessible from his party. So that sort of made things worse.
And the young prince in this drama is Adithya Thackeray, with parallels being drawn with Rahul Gandhi and so on. There were murmurs that his dramatic rise to power only at 32 years, and his supposed high-handedness was also one of the reasons of this government's collapse. Right? What do you see as his future, and where do you think he goes from here?
See, I think his future is inextricably tied for the immediate future to the rise of the future of those Uddhav faction of the Sena. Whether it manages to get recognized as the original Sena or the real Sena, keep the symbol. That's point number one. Point number two is whether how even if it does that, how well will it perform in the upcoming municipal election? The BMC is Sena's mainstay, right? I mean, the control of the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation. The last I think 34 or 35 years, it's been controlled by the Sena. Of course, almost always in alliance with the BJP, but I mean, the Sena has practically run it for now 34, 35 years. Some of its other corporations, it's again controlled by and large. Thane is another big one, which is of course practically run by Mr. Shinde. Aurangabad's another one that it invariably has control of, or I should say Sambhaji Nagar now. But the big test for this entire faction right now, Aditya Thackeray's political future to start with is combined to that. But see, he's clearly tried to create an image for himself, right, as a climate change kind of a politician or a young guy who's focusing on climate change, on some of the softer aspects. And I'm not calling climate change soft, but like if you go to if you go to Mumbai, you will see that the kind of aesthetic changes that have happened in large parts of the city, right? I mean, these are it's he's very clearly using an American term, he's clearly appealing to the professional urban to urban professionals, right? I mean, especially the young urban professional. I mean, I am not sure how sustainable a strategy that is in India, just for the simple reason that I mean, there are not a lot of them. I mean, even in Mumbai, it's not like Mumbai is full of young urban professionals. We've discussed this before, right? Like Rahul Gandhi sort of has a similar aspiration for the Congress.
Hmm.
And I think one thing Aditya Thackeray at least has been, or Uddhav and Aditya both have been successful over the last few years, is in completely leaving behind the baggage of the Hindutva thing, right? I mean, obviously now they've lost probably the good things of that also, like so 39 MLAs or whatever. I think if you're a progressive voter in India today, I don't think most of them have a problem with the Sena.
Hmm.
You see it on Twitter, you see it on TV, you see it on Facebook, you see it everywhere, right? Like the people who are by and large who you can call urban progressive, they're all fully on board with the Sena. But again, how relevant that is as a political force is going to be difficult to understand at this point of time. And the other big thing is, see, this would have worked out better for Aditya if he already had a base to hold on to, right? But unfortunately, the events of the last 10 days have sort of denuded him of a large part of that base. I mean, of course, we'll need to wait for elections to see how exactly it is. And for all you know, maybe the Uddhav faction of the Sena, by whatever name it's called, retains the bulk of the Sena vote in even outside Mumbai, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm skeptical of that. But if that is the case, then this has worked out well for him, because I think the Sena clearly has that kind of a phase now in Maharashtra. But I would say at least that right now he had tried to sort of build a new image for himself on the foundations of his party, and he thought that the charismatic authority of the Thackeray's, right, over the Sena cadre. I mean, that's where that sense of obligation at least flew from over the last, or that was everyone's understanding till 10 days back. That would allow him to retain the base while at the same time pivoting the party for all practical purposes in a completely new direction, right? Like he could have a party based on Marathi linguistic nationalism, on Hindutva, built on the votes of the lower middle class or working class Maharashtrians in urban areas, and an assortment of people in the rural areas, primarily people who had problems with the Congress and the NCP nation, and steer that in a more progressive kind of a direction, solely based on the charismatic legacy of the family, right? But that's clearly gone. The base is sort of splintered, broken together. So now he has to keep it back with this thing, right? And I mean, I think they also realized at some point that they need to get the Hindutva thing also back. That's why they did the renaming on the last day. I don't think that's had any impact. I mean, at least the renaming has worked. So there is some understanding that there's a lot of work to do. I'm not sure how they will be go about it. Of course, the next 6 months will give us a huge clue.
Let's talk about, I think, my favorite character in this drama, right? Which is Devendra Fadnavis. If revenge is a dish best served cold, I think Devendra Fadnavis has chilled it twice over and served it to Uddhav Thackeray. He's seeing redemption now, right? I mean, as the deputy chief minister, he's been really patient all this while, and it seems to have paid off.
Yeah, see, I think whatever happened in 2019 obviously took a huge toll on Devendra Fadnavis, right? I mean, he was very confident that they were coming back to power. He sort of governed that the elections were merely a formality, and I mean, there were mistakes in that regard, right? I mean, the results weren't great, to be honest. Multiple reasons for that, but end of the day, they did get power back, right? I mean, the government did come back, so he would have expected it to continue. He had a good working relationship with the Sena ministers, as you can see, but he must have. I'm sure he thought he had a good working relationship with even Mr. Thackeray or whatever the issues were. He was probably sure they could be sorted out. Then he realized that wasn't happening. Then the whole Ajit Pawar fiasco happened, right? I mean, just imagine it from his shoes, Mr. Thackeray. I mean, Mr. Fadnavis' shoes. Like he was completely humiliated nationally, right? I mean, and then he had to literally spend 2 years fighting against a fairly vindictive government. I mean, if you look at the whole issues with Anil Deshmukh, what happened, and then of course the power of the central government obviously helped in a lot of these cases in terms of nullifying the acts of the state government. But he had to, and Maharashtra, I mean, its core is the most transactional political state in India, right? Like MLA switch sides like nothing. I mean, there's no, for a long time, there was no real ideological difference between all of these parties. They all, of course, at the top there were differences, but at the cadre level, all four at some level were like sections of all four cadre were indistinguishable. People could cross over from any of these parties. There are people who have gone Sena, NCP, Sena, right? Narayan Rane went Sena, Congress, BJP. The others have gone Congress, BJP. So it's been a literal free for all in that kind of a situation. And all of these MLAs of the BJP, they expected to be in power, right? Everyone expected the BJP to be in power in Maharashtra in 2009. So obviously this guy managed to, in spite of his personal loss of faith, he couldn't sulk, right? Because then these MLAs would start running away. Obviously the fact that this is powerful central government helped, but he was able to corral these guys. Not a single one of them defected for 2.5 years, right? That's like an amazing statistic. He managed to fight by-elections. There were various by-elections. They won one by-election. In two by-elections against the Congress, where the Sena had fought as NDA candidate in 2019, in spite of some local sympathy for the Congress candidates because they were the child and wife of the deceased MLAs. The BJP managed to get the bulk of the NDA vote of 2019, right? So he literally managed to sort of keep the impression that this was a party in waiting. He kept the party disciplined. He kept the party machinery running. He kept winning election. I mean, not contesting, and he just didn't give a free ride to these guys on anything, right? That obviously mattered. And at the same time, he worked on other BJP organizational stuff, whether in Goa or in Bihar. So I mean, then of course the last few weeks were his final payoff, right? Starting with the Rajya Sabha win, MLC, and then of course this. So I mean, it's been a redemption tale for him, and the punishment he gave Uddhav was like brutal, right? I mean, he didn't just take away his post; he took away his party, which is like
Yeah, it's
a whole
pretty,
level different.
just a whole other level, I think. Yeah, and he also has a pretty good working relationship with Eknath Shinde as well, right? I mean, they've been cabinet colleagues before, and also I think as the chief minister, he also trusted Mr. Shinde with some main key projects and stuff like that. You think, I mean, the both of them will have a better working relationship together than, let's say, I mean, what maybe Fadnavis and Uddhav Thackeray had earlier.
See, I mean, when I mentioned about this BJP Sena relationship, and I'm not trying to romanticize it, but the BJP and the Sena had a very peculiar relationship, right? Because unlike the other allies, they were ideologically literally the same for almost 20 years. They also had a very clear seat distribution. Everyone knew what seats would be contested by and large. So the two parties, to that extent, were. I mean, I think most leaders have by and large had very good relationships with people across this thing. The same goes for Mr. Fadnavis and Shinde, right? I mean, they were both senior leaders of their respective parties by 2009, and in the 5 years of opposition, as well as they were both, probably you could say correctly, the senior second level leadership, right? Because 2009 to 14, if the Sena had Bala Sahib Thackeray and Uddhav Thackeray right on top, the BJP had Gopinath Munde and Nitin Gadkari. Mr. Fadnavis was one level below them before the 2014 results and Mr. Munde's death, and then the elections, and then Mr. Fadnavis' ascension to CM-ship. The same was the case with Mr. Shinde, right? So they obviously then they were colleagues in the cabinet, unlike Uddhav, who was out of the cabinet. From what I remember, I think Mr. Shinde only was a PWD minister in the Fadnavis government. He had the charge of the whole, especially the Mumbai Nagpur Expressway. I may be wrong, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what I vaguely remember. So, which was like one of the pet projects of Mr. Fadnavis. And even, I mean, if you read stuff from the time of this whole 2019 crisis, it was clear that Mr. Shinde probably preferred the BJP for whatever. I mean, he claims there were ideological reasons. I think that's it. I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt there. But even otherwise, he obviously also had a working relationship with Mr. Fadnavis, which also led to him being looked upon suspiciously by the NCP as well as the Sena, right? So to that extent, we are very. I think that clearly will work out for the both of them because it's a tricky situation, right? I mean, there's been a lot of chatter on social media. Somebody who was a CM before is now being a DCM to somebody who was his cabinet colleague before. While this has happened a lot of times in the Congress governments of Maharashtra, it's not very common otherwise. And I'm sure this relationship will definitely. I mean, the fact that they have a good relationship will at least smoothen this whole process.
So finally, this is yet another successful Operation Lotus or Operation Kamala, as you mentioned earlier. What do you think was the role of the Prime Minister and the Home Minister and the BJP central leadership and so on? Right? There was some chatter that some central agencies were used to go after certain MLAs and so on and so forth. Right? Yeah. I mean, what do you make of the BJP central leadership role in this?
So obviously, the BJP central leadership had a very key role, right? I mean, people were leaving from Maharashtra. They were first going to Surat, which is the BJP ruled state. It's also the it's technically it's Navsari, but Surat is part of parts of Surat are in the it's the home base of C.R. Patil, right? Who's the BJP state chief of Gujarat. He's also a Maratha, and he's also very close to the prime minister, right? So clearly, C.R. Patil had a role in this thing. Then they all went to Guwahati, which is again, of course, ruled by the BJP. It's literally a poster city or state of the BJP ruled by a poster CM. And you had, Sharad Pawar saying they were trying, the NCP and the Sena were trying to break into the hotel to meet the MLAs, just couldn't do anything. Things like that. So obviously that is, and you can't do all of this without, I mean, look at the sheer number of people who were, I mean, let's give the benefit of the doubt to the MVA government and assume they were not facilitating MLAs leaving the state. So there were people actually leaving the state one after the other for an entire week, moving to another state which was BJP ruled, then seamlessly transiting through Surat into Guwahati, and then they were all going to Goa. So obviously, I mean, this was a central. Really, I mean, this had a lot of parts of the central this thing in operation. So there were a couple of MLAs also, as you rightly mentioned, who have other issues with central agencies. We'll need to see how that'll pan out, whatever those issues are, and how that'll get resolved. But I think Vaibhav Purandare, who's written a couple of books on the Sena, which are worth reading for anyone who wants to learn more about this fascinating political organization, wouldn't necessarily called a party. He said, it's not like all the urban and rural MLAs, all of these guys have cases. I mean, that's not the case. Couple of them, or maybe three, four of them, who have issues, but the rest of them are by and large. I mean, they have no reason to just rely on the agents. But yeah, obviously, I mean, it was a fairly concerted effort from the BJP at all levels. I would say. I mean, when people talk about Amit Shah, Devendra Fadnavis, various others having a role, I mean, nothing happens without the prime minister's take on the matter, right? I mean, if you even have a basic understanding of the BJP, you would realize that these kind of things obviously have the prime minister's role in it. And he's the most skilled political operative in India, right? I mean, by far. Everybody else is a kid in front of him, so I'm sure he had his inputs on it. Probably the man even knows these MLAs by name, right? Before at least who these people are and what they were. I
Yeah.
think you have to give him that.
With this template being replicated in multiple states, right? I mean, will we see some kind of pressure to strengthen, anti-defection laws and so on?
I don't know. I don't think how it can be strengthened anymore, right? I mean, I am a pretty vocal opponent of the anti-defection law, at least in its present form, right? Because it's quite clearly absurd. I mean, you have 39 MLAs out of a 55-member party wanting to go somewhere else, and people are saying they're subject to the anti-defection law. It's literally like you're saying people are electing 55 people to be Uddhav Thackeray's slaves, right? I mean, that's like then what? Then you need to change your system. Let Uddhav Thackeray only start. I mean, you can't have this level of anti-defection law in a parliamentary form of government, right? Then you have or at least a first past the post parliamentary system. They have a presidential system, have closed list proportional voting. There are multiple options, right? I mean, but if your idea is that the party leader should literally be able to treat his MLAs like cattle, then the electoral system needs to reflect that. You can't just keep tightening one part of it. When 39 guys have a problem with Uddhav Thackeray, what are they supposed to do? That's not clearly anti-defection. And if you ask me, at least in the previous states, I mean, you resign, then how will anti-defection apply to you? You are putting yourself at the mercy of the voters again. I don't understand why anti. Which is why I mean, even in my college days, I had a huge problem with the kind of descriptions used of Operation Kamala, because I mean, a lot of that at least I thought was directed by animals, maybe well deserved against the Reddy brothers, but or I mean, more than animals, like general disgust and discomfort with their styles of operation. But I mean, that's not the point, right? I mean, the point is that you have been elected as an MLA. You're not a slave. I mean, yes, you shouldn't be allowed to freely go here and there just for money. But if you're willing to stake your seat, resign, and it's not easy to get elected. I mean, so many of the guys who came to BJP in the I mean, 2008 Karnataka, 2018 Karnataka, 2013 MP, people have lost seats. I mean, they've resigned and they've not got re-elected. If somebody is for whatever reason willing to take his seat on the line, I mean, you can't do anything about it. And again, how can you prevent someone from resigning? I mean,
Right. Yeah, and whatever you say about politicians, I mean, they have the maximum skin in the game, right? I mean,
yeah, I
so
mean,
yeah,
because skin is a seat, right? If I'm willing to put my seat
exactly.
on the
On
line,
the line.
then clearly I have a huge problem. I mean, whatever it may be.
Right. What do you see as the future for the Shiv Sena, NCP, and BJP in the state, and how do you see all of this impacting the run up to the 2024 elections? Maharashtra is an important state anyway, right?
So I think it's a bit premature to ask this question, because we really need to see what is the public reaction to these two Senas, right? Like there are clearly two Senas, though Shinde Sena says they still respect Uddhav Thackeray and whatever, but there are clearly two Senas, right? Who gets the public on their side to some extent is important. But if you ask me, I mean, the BJP making Mr. Shinde the CM is clearly well thought. It understands that there is a caste problem in Maharashtra that it faces. It understands that Maharashtra is too big a state for any single party to get a majority. It also understands that the Shiv Sena, and this is beyond caste, right? It also appeals to a certain group of people who, for whatever reasons, may not want to vote BJP, even if they're fully aligned with the BJP, right? At least at the state level. I don't think that's a problem at the national level, but at least at the state. So all of these things put together, I think that's where the BJP has come. It has a clear strategy. It thinks that it can trust I mean, for lack of the better word, the Shinde Sena completely, right? Completely aligned ideologically to the BJP. It doesn't think they will go anywhere else, even if there are normal disagreements over seat sharing and stuff like that. They see a long-term relationship, and to that extent, they think that if you look at Maharashtra's results over the last several years, right, in Lok Sabha, the BJP and the Sena have generally done very well. I mean, the Modi elections, of course, both I think they crossed 40 out of 48, which is a huge number. But even otherwise, whenever they've done badly at other states, Maharashtra they've always done respectably well. I think 99 they had a lead. Only in 98 there was a wipeout due to heavy anti-incumbency against the first Sena BJP. But 96 they had a lead. 98 9 they had a lead. 2004 interestingly they got wiped out in Bombay. Otherwise they were by and large in the lead. And I think even otherwise overall they had a small lead. 2009 they were a bit behind, but that was almost entirely due to the whole MNS effect. Presumably it was a one-time thing. Let's see how it works with the Uddhav faction of the Sena, but I think that should be okay. I think the BJP, at least strategically, or it's in the best shape it thinks it could have hoped to be in for 2024. Because otherwise it was up against this unified MVA. I still think they would have done fairly well, but this is obviously a much better situation for the BJP to be. For the Uddhav Sena, we already discussed, they really need to rebuild from scratch, you could say. For the Shinde Sena, it really depends, right? How many more people who are not MLAs come to them? Like whether it's MPs, more importantly, corporators, people at the lower levels, like the Shakas, right? The Shakas are the lifeblood of the Sena. How do the Shaka workers turn up different? Because Sena is a heavily Kada-based party, so it matters. Which are the regions where they can get an upper hand? How many of these MLAs in the rural areas can get their Kada with them? So that's what would really matter for the Shinde Sena. For NCP, I think this has been a big disaster, right? Like in the sense that they were controlling a government, they've lost it. The NCP has a huge internal factional fight, and it's not that Ajit Pawar randomly woke up in the morning and decided he'll have fun in being a deputy chief minister for a day with Devendra Fadnavis. I think it all got forgotten in the whole thing of people praising Sharad Pawar as a Chanakya of Maharashtra, or whatever, and making fun of Fadnavis, Amit Shah. But like, there's clearly a factional divide in the NCP, right? I know from people who I speak with on Maharashtra politics that this whole government was really helping Sharad Pawar solidify support for his daughter Supriya over Ajit Pawar. That's the big divide that exists in the NCP. There's a personality divide. It has some sort of comfort level with different parties divide, etc. And Sharad Pawar at least was finding this MVA government very useful for that purpose. Even if you see all the discussions that happened in Matoshri, etc., saves his government. I mean, Sharad Pawar would go with Jayant Patil, with Walse Patil, with Jitendra Awad, but rarely Ajit Pawar. Clearly, there's a this thing there. You heard that Dhananjay Munde, who's known to be close to Ajit Pawar, met Fadnavis the day of the swearing in. Again, I mean, you don't know what it's. So the NCP, I think Sharad Pawar at least thought government would help him transition the party more effectively to Supriya and also to his grandnephew Rohit Pawar, who would become an MLA. But that's been sort of thrown into the this thing by this whole thing, right? Back to the drawing board for Sharad Pawar at least. And he's not getting any younger, right? It's going to be tricky for him.
Yeah.
And of course, you forgot, but I would mention the Congress. The Congress had a bad time, right? I mean, it had decent ministries, but it was really not being seen as really playing in the government. But it got all its anti-incumbency. Now it's back. It's again out of the government. There are very credible rumors of a number of Congress MLAs wanting to defect. And I think what's happened though, see, the old Congress coalition in Maharashtra was by and large Muslims, Mahars, and Marathas. Marathas sort of moved to the NCP. First, they moved, some sections moved to the Sena and the BJP. A large number of them moved to the NCP once Sharad Pawar created the NCP. Congress, by and large, at its core, party of Muslims, Mahars, and local satraps, right? And the satraps have been chipped away by the BJP year on year. That process, I think, is going to continue. Muslims, AIMIM is remarkably potent in Maharashtra in a way it is not in the north or anywhere, and that makes sense, right? I mean, AIMIM is a Hyderabad, Maharashtra. Parts of it were part of the Hyderabad Nizam's dominion, which explains a lot of the politics of the Marathwada region. Even otherwise, AIMIM has more appeal in Maharashtra than it has in a lot of other states, and the Congress's continued weakening is going to give it a opening. Same with the Vanchit Bahujan Aghadi of Prakash Ambedkar, been making concerted attack on the scheduled caste, especially Mahar vote, and also other communities, but especially this particular community's vote. He did reasonably well in both the elections in 2019, though he couldn't really break through. So the Congress going back into disarray really makes it more difficult for them to get all of these guys back on their side. I mean, they're back to the basics again. So that way, I mean, I don't know if I'm looking at it in a particular manner, but I think this is, as of now, it seems to have worked out really well for the BJP and its new ally, right? I mean, the Eknath Shinde faction of the Shiv Sena. Let's see.
Finally, when we look at the state itself, right, infrastructure projects have languished. It was also one of the worst performing states, COVID wise. What do you see as all of this having an impact on the governance of Maharashtra? Do you see better days ahead?
I think, see, again, whatever you mentioned, there are clearly ideological differences, right? I mean, on infrastructure, like whether it's the metro and the RA shed, which gets a lot of emotion, the bullet train, I'm just talking about a few things, right? The Delhi Mumbai Expressway, and these are things which create clear ideological issues between certain parties. So obviously, the BJP is on one side of it, it will be able to push all of this through. By and large, Mr. Eknath Shinde is also on the same page on these things. I think that will definitely be pushed through. In terms of COVID, again, I mean, you've seen all the posts of lots of people saying Maharashtra was one of the states that managed COVID the best. There's been a lot of chatter on this. I mean, COVID is one thing on which I don't really discuss with people, right? I mean, you can either say the stats are wrong, the stats are made up, or the stats are about more transparency. There's no, like, it really everyone just says things that justifies their price. So let's forget that. But I mean, the state, I don't think this government was very popular. At least that's the impression I got from people, and I think the by-elections by and large showcase that. I mean, there was, and the fact that so many people are moving, right? I mean, MLAs by and large know what's up, and it's not like all 39 of them would have been denied tickets or something. I mean, there's no question of that. By and large, Sena gives tickets to the same people, so clearly they knew there was something wrong, and I think at least in large parts of the state there was some sort of anti-incumbency against this government. That's up to this government to correct, right? I mean, the new government, what they do, whether it's on some of the more emotive issues or the headline items like the infrastructure projects we mentioned, emotive issues like freedom of speech. I mean, again, I don't know what's the politically the right wing point on that. Sharad Pawar is a well-respected leader in Maharashtra, whether you like it or not. People are getting arrested for abusing him. Or rather disrespecting him. Does the current government really want to go against that line of thought? I don't know. I mean, the new government. It's not like the BJP was, coming out and making statements in favor of Ketki Chitle or whatever happened with Sharad Pawar. So these are different kinds of things, and obviously there'll be a change in government. Lots of things have already started moving. Today you saw the NIA case, the Amravati killing being handed over to the NIA. Another, emotional issue at a national level is the case of the Palghar Sadhu. Let's see what happens on that. But I think nuts and bolts, I don't know, maybe one would expect a better governance, at least for the sake of the state, because the last government wasn't very popular. But let's see how. There's no point in pointing fingers at governance.
Well, that brings us to the end of a rather long, comprehensive, and fascinating discussion. Thanks, Rohit. I mean, as always, you continue to surprise me with the depth depth of knowledge that you have on some of these things. It was wonderful talking to you, and all the best to the new Maharashtra government. All the best to the citizens of the state, I should say.
Thanks, Kevin. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.